We are starting skeletal system 2. This is going to be all about bones in the skeletal system and parts of the bones you need to know for the quizzes and or tests. Normally I would do all this in class and you would be able to have skull and skeleton to mess with. Yep, we got to do it this way. Axial skeleton is the middle portions, including the skull, the vertebral column, and the ribs. The appendicular are the shoulder, hips, and then the arms and legs that go with those. Identify them here with the blue being the axial, and notice the bone colored ones are the appendicular. There's features of the bones. You need to familiarize yourself with all of these features. There's several slides on it. The condyles, what they are, facets, heads, crests, epicondyle, line, process, spine. When you're looking at the bone, it's a little easier to actually see these. So when we'll get to the features of the pictures of the bones, it'll be a little bit easier to do it. We have trochanters. These are only found on femurs, so that's easy there. Yeah, tubercles, tuberosities, alveolus, fossas, foveas. The only fovea we're going to look at really would be the fovea capitis. Again, it's on a femur. Canals, fissures, foramen, meatus, sinus. Then of the skull, we have cranial bones, facial bones, and then other bones that are associated with the skull. So these are the cranial bones. Again, it makes a little bit more sense whenever you see the pictures, but we have the frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, sphenoid, ethmoid bones. And then for the facial bones, you have the maxilla, palatine, zygomatic, lacrimal, nasal, vomer, and mandible. Here's an anterior view of the skull. I know it seems daunting, but you need to familiarize yourself with all of these labeled features on here. I've removed anything I didn't want you to know about. There's fissures. See the slits. That's the superior orbital fissure. You have an inferior orbital fissure. There's an optic canal where the eye nerve goes through. You see here's another thing you've heard, foramen. So the mental foramen is a hole in the jawbone where nerves go through. So again, familiarize yourself with all of these parts of the bones. This is the anterior view of it. Here's a side view. I've put in squares the parts that you couldn't see before on the first one. So these will be the new features. Yes, again, it seems very daunting. It's not that bad once you really get started and you put in a little bit of effort to learn all of these. Some of them have multiple, and like here, the condylar process up here, mandibular notch and mandibular ramus. They're pretty easy if you actually get in and put a little bit of time into it. You have an inferior view. Again, palatine process. I removed some things. If you have the textbook, it's going to say some other stuff out here, but I want you to know it as the palatine process, or the horizontal plate right here, the incisive fossa, the intermaxillary suture here, the median palatine suture. You have lots of foramen with the holes through here. Sometimes they're called foramen, sometimes it's called a canal, sometimes it's called a meatus. Again, be familiarized with where they are. Right here, you're going to have a protuberance, the external occipital for that matter. And it sticks off on the back of the head. There's a crest that goes down it. You'll have a superior nuchal line and an inferior nuchal line. Again, familiarize yourself with these parts. We have an internal portion of this. This entire region here is called the cribriform plate. You see it right there. There's a little ridge in the middle called the crista galli. You see a bunch of little holes in here. This is the cribriform foramina. Foramina is plural for foramen. Right? This foramen rotundum is you cannot see from the outside, so it's one on the inside. You got the internal acoustic meatus on the inside, because on the outside you had an external acoustic meatus. You've got an anterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, posterior cranial fossa. You have one thing right here called the sella turcica. To translate that, that means turkey saddle. So try to remember that one. Some people have a hard time doing that one. but that hopefully that'll help a little. Bones associated with the skull. You have your auditory bones, ossicles, the malleus, incus, and stapes. Then you have the hyoid bone, which is right here in the neck. There again is a picture of it. There's the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. It transmits vibrations from the eardrum over to the internal ear, so we can make understand the sound. The hyoid right there, it's your Adam's apple, and everybody has an Adam's apple. Swallow, you feel that thing moving up and down because it helps us swallow. It helps us talk. It helps us keep our airway open when we're sleeping. This is the only bone that does not touch another bone. Every other bone in the body touches at least one other bone. This is the only one that does not. Newborn skulls. The sutures, we can go back here quite a ways to here, squamous suture, lambdoid suture, occipital mastoid suture, coronal suture. We look at those because that's where the bones come together. They are not that way on an infant's skull, and they have those soft spots because they haven't grown together, and that's because as the infant is passing through the birth canal, it's got to be able to flex and move a little bit. So babies have that soft. The older you get, the harder your head gets. You know, everybody gets hard-headed, right? So there you go. These sutures will fuse together as you get older. We have a vertebral column, the disc. They get broken down into various regions: cervical, thoracic, lumbar. It makes sense when you look at the picture. So the top curve up here, which is your neck, is called the cervical curvature. There's 7 vertebrae because all mammals have 7 vertebrae, whether it's a giraffe or whale or mouse. All mammals have 7 vertebrae. And then we have our thoracic curvature. There's 12 vertebrae here. This is important because we have 12 ribs, and the ribs all attach to the thoracic vertebrae. Then you have your lumbar, your lower back. There's 5 vertebrae there. Your sacrum, which is your rear end. This is where you have 5 fused vertebrae there, and your tailbone is there's 4 vertebrae fused there. Again, these curvatures are named for the regions they are found in. And we have some, let me back up. This normal curvature like this is, we get this as we get older and learn to walk. If our back doesn't get like this, we don't ever learn to walk because a baby's back is not curved this way. We get those curvatures as you walk. If you have some abnormalities, you can have a lateral curvature, scoliosis, a forward curvature at the thoracic region. This is called kyphosis. And where the thoracic and lumbar regions is a forward curve in the hair is called a lordosis. Your vertebrae, generic vertebrae here. These are all the parts of a vertebrae that you would need to know. Notice that the pedicle is between the transverse and the body. The lamina is between the spinous process and the transverse process. People get those confused sometimes. Again, you need to know these for the quizzes and or tests. Your sternum, you have the top portion called the manubrium that has a jugular notch and clavicular notch. It's joined to the body of the sternum by the sternal angle. At the inferior end of the sternum is the xyphosternal joint, which joins to the xiphoid process. In your ribs, you have a total of 12 ribs. The first 7 are called true ribs because they attach directly to the sternum. Then you have 5 ribs that are called false ribs. 3 of those false ribs are attached to the 7th rib, and 2 of them are floating ribs. Here's the parts of the rib. You have the head that attaches to the vertebrae. You have a neck. You have the articular fossa, which again attaches to the transverse process, I believe it is. You have the angle of the rib, the costal groove, and the shaft of the rib. This is the sacrum. You need to know all the parts: the body, the transverse ridges, the anterior sacral foramina, the apex, the coccyx, the sacral promontories, the top bridge here, the ala. On the posterior view, you have your sacral canal, You have your auricular surface where it joins with the hip bone. You have lateral crest, a medial crest, posterior sacral foramina, the interior bottom of these fused vertebrae is called the sacral hiatus. The top is again that canal. Familiarize yourself with all of these bones. Be familiar with those foramen, those processes, the locations. There's some examples like the nuchal line in the back of the head, the mastoid process right behind the ear, the nubrium at the top of the sternum, etc. Be familiar with all of that. That will end skeletal lecture number 2.